Finally, from Solly Lord Zuckerman. Zuckerman, Dr. Robinson, very well acquainted with the work of Zuckerman. Zuckerman, for many years, head of the Department of Anatomy at the University of Birmingham. He was first knighted for his distinguished scientific career and then raised to the peerage. He's now Lord Zuckerman. Lord Zuckerman has evaluated exactly the same evidence that Dr. Robinson has as far as the so-called man-like status of Australopithecus, Homo africanus, whatever you want to call it. And Lord Zuckerman, after many, many years of tremendously detailed and thorough research, concludes that these creatures did not walk upright. They were not intermediate between ape and man, but that they were apes and not the ancestors of man. What I want to read is his assessment of this whole area of study of the search for man's fossil ancestry. Now, Zuckerman is not a creationist. You're not hearing a creationist. You are hearing an expert anatomist, a man who's devoted years and years of study to this field of science, a man who is an evolutionist. Listen to what he has to say on page 64 of his book, Beyond the Ivory Tower. Lord Zuckerman says on page 64, quote, "No scientist could logically dispute the proposition that man, without having been involved in any act of divine creation, evolved from some ape-like creature in a very short space of time, speaking in geological terms, without leaving any fossil traces." End of quote. See what Lord Zuckerman is saying? If you set aside the possibility of creation, which we don't, of course, but if you do that, then no scientist could logically dispute the fact that man has evolved from an ape-like creature without leaving any trace in the fossil record. Now, I know most of the evolutionary world is arguing for all of these transitional forms. But apparently Lord Zuckerman doesn't believe there is any science in this field, and he says so. And he says that these forms are not transitional. They do not link man to any ape. Now, he may believe that man has evolved, but there is no evidence for it in the fossil record. And that is what I maintain, that when we look at the fossil record, we do find the abrupt appearance of highly diverse forms, highly complex forms without ancestors. We do find the fossils of the various kinds without transitional forms. And this is what we would expect on the basis of creation, but not evolution. All the facts from biology, probability theory, the laws of thermodynamics, which I've not dealt with specifically here tonight, and the fossil record itself supports that in the beginning God created. Thank you very much.
We're now ready for the part of the program under the rebuttals. Professor Robinson will have the first rebuttal. This will be for 15 minutes. Professor Robinson.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Gish said at the outset in his presentation that we should leave his religion out of it because it's as irrelevant as mine. Now, what I tried to show is that it wasn't irrelevant. It is not a question of of looking into his religious beliefs. It was that the statement that he and his colleagues make about the orientation from which they proceed has a very clear effect on how he looks at scientific evidence. And that was the point I wanted to make clear, not that he should or shouldn't have that orientation. He has an absolute right to believe what he wishes. All I was trying to do was to show what the effect on how he looks at scientific evidence is of that particular point of view. As the quotation showed, you see, he cannot, by the belief that he has chosen, he cannot accept any evidence that approves of evolution. Therefore, as the one quotation from Dr. Morris pointed out, it is his duty as a Christian to explain away that scientific evidence that appears to support evolution. And it is for this reason that I think it is crucial to understand that in fact that is his orientation. Not that I'm saying there's anything wrong with it, but to understand where he's coming from, of how he looks at scientific evidence. That the definition of what is good scientific evidence is that it fits with a literal interpretation of the Bible. It's not a matter of that there's good supporting evidence for what he's accepting as science. It's a matter of, does it fit with that particular criterion which may not be transgressed? And one sees this very much when Dr. Gish speaks of that this must be so, or this couldn't have been so. See, this is not the way conventional scientists look at the situation. One doesn't say the universe could not possibly have originated without supernatural agency. One has a look to see how far one can get with explaining the situation in terms of the physical scientific evidence. You see, again we come to the fact that if we are arguing in terms of scientific evidence, then we must use the methods of science as far as that evidence is concerned. And the methods of science do not allow us to put spiritual interpretations into our theories, because there are no methods that science has at the present time. Maybe at some point in the future, science will have developed techniques whereby this becomes possible. There is a lot of interest developing in what are basically spiritual notions in science. Physics, for example, is very strongly going in this direction. But until such time as there are means of handling that kind of information scientifically, you cannot distinguish between a theory that has a supernatural element and one that does not. There's no means of testing that scientifically. One also sees the influence of this point of view, of this use of an absolutely authoritative criterion that says precisely what you can and what you can't do, in the way Dr. Gish quotes scientists. His comments about Dr. Grassi, for example, and his point of view. The fact that that's what Dr. Grassi believes is not binding on any other scientist at all. That's his personal reading of the evidence. And if further evidence supports him, more and more scientists are going to go in that direction. If evidence does not support him, they won't follow it. The fact that he is a well-known biologist confers no authority whatsoever on what he says. It has to stand up to the facts. I would like also just to point out that the kind of problem I'm speaking about here that makes this sort of debate essentially two people talking right past each other without any real point of contact is not a question that I feel in any way that this applies to any, quote, religious interpretation. That isn't what I mean. There's a problem here in relation to scientific evidence only with the strict interpretation of the Bible as literally true. That creation occurred in 6 days of 24 hours and only 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. There are many other people who are Christians, who accept the Christian point of view, who find the Bible to be a highly instructive spiritual manual, but who do not take that particular extreme orientation. And it's only with that extreme orientation that one has the problem with scientific evidence, because of the particularly inflexible attitude that is taken, that nothing can ever, no matter what the evidence is, no matter what evidence is turned up, it can't ever show that evolution is true. There are many people who accept the point of view that creation has indeed occurred, but that it's occurring over long periods of time. That point of view, the scientific evidence has no quarrel with at all. It's perfectly consistent with the scientific evidence. You can either interpret it that way, or you can interpret it in a materialistic way. That's up to you. But there's no clash. But you see, the particular orientation that Dr. Gish has makes him say that that's not a viable point of view. It's not an acceptable point of view. It's either a strictly creationist point of view in this narrow sense, or it's the opposite extreme, an atheistic interpretation. And you will notice that Dr. Gish, again, because of this orientation, is still strictly defining evolution as a materialistic process. As I pointed out, students of evolution, people who are concerned with it all the time, do not in fact define evolution that way, except in their philosophical interpretations. As scientists, they do not interpret it that way. And there are a few points that I would like to make also that, for example, Dr. Gish mentioned that the question of homology and the genes associated with it really destroys the whole idea of genes having anything to do with bringing about evolution. We have clear evidence in a number of experimental situations where identical, even in the same species, in identically the same species, not even subspecies different, that you have different genes producing the same character. So you see, you have a situation here where in one circumstance, for example, in one of these cases, two populations of dark moths sufficiently far apart that there's no crossing of individuals from the one population to the other, so they couldn't be influencing each other, had developed identically the same mechanism of going dark to adapt to the industrial situations. But in fact, when they crossed with each other, the character breaks down entirely. The reason for that being that they haven't got the same gene components making up the character. So you see, natural selection can build up different genetic mechanisms of producing exactly the same characteristic. So it doesn't necessarily follow that one has to have all the time genes that are so identical that you can identify them. In any case, I'm not aware of any studies that are sufficiently detailed about the genetic control of things like vertebrate limb structure that would allow one to be able to detect identity of genes. Beneficial mutations are not as rare as Dr. Gish states. As I pointed out in my original discussion, there are large numbers of experimental studies in the literature, and they're increasing all the time. There are masses of studies in which beneficial mutations have been demonstrated. For example, in the Drosophila material, as I pointed out, somewhere around 3 to 5% of mutations that are observed have in fact got beneficial effects. And those are only the ones where one can demonstrate fairly substantial effects. And it's becoming increasingly clear that many genes have extremely subtle effects as well. And those are not quite so easy to pin down, where the mutation produces a very slight alteration in one of the effects that a gene has, but that many can be shown to have good effects is extremely well documented experimentally. That's not guesses, but by direct genetic experimentation demonstrating the increased viability due to a mutation. And in this connection, one would also point out that Dr. Gish has made much of the fact that the basis of the evolutionary interpretation of scientists is that everything is random. Now, randomness is certainly there as far as mutations are concerned. Not randomness in the sense that mutations can happen in any direction. They can't. You can't make too many changes to a gene without turning it into something that's not a gene. The chemical directions in which changes can occur are reasonably limited. But what is meant by randomness in this situation is that the characters that come up, the new characters that come up by mutation, are not aimed at satisfying a need that the population feels at that time. If it needs certain characteristics, so to speak, in order to adapt further to the population, mutation doesn't automatically produce those characters that are needed. It produces characters which have no specific relationship to the needs. But natural selection is not random. And so the random genetic process of producing variability, which is not purely due to mutation, incidentally, recombination produces a very much higher amount of actual practical variation in the population than mutation does, although that is dependent initially on there being new mutations. But if there are a relatively small amount of new mutations, that produces a very large amount of new variation. And therefore there's a much greater amount than is simply indicated by the random mutations that occur, because each new combination of genes has different effects, even the positions in which they are in relation to each other. And natural selection is not something that scientists have just dreamed up and have no evidence for. It's been documented over and over again in studies which show perfectly well, as in the case, for example, of these moth populations that have darkened that I've spoken about. An interesting thing is that when the darkening first started, when industrial pollution started in the middle of last century, one had a rapid change in the population. Within less than 50 years, populations that had had no dark forms changed to having up to 98% of dark forms. And they've stayed stable at about 98% or somewhat less in those extreme populations. But now laws against pollution have been introduced, and the situation is just shifting right back again. One's now got up to 25% of light forms instead of 2% of light forms, because natural selection is just quite automatically shifting it back. But many studies, detailed genetic studies, long-term studies on populations, have demonstrated the efficacy of natural selection. It is not something, as far as producing genetic change is concerned, that is simply guesswork. It is experimentally demonstrated with extremely good quality work. Could I have the few slides now, please? Well, unfortunately, that's a little bit light. Could you get the light down still a bit more? Here, all right. Here we have Archaeopteryx that we were talking about a little bit earlier. And if you look instead of at a reconstruction, which of course can only be guessed at what it looked like, you can't have detailed reconstruction in spite of the fact that we have reasonably good evidence in this case. But you see the skeleton of that thing. It's not a bird skeleton. What bird has a long bony tail that's as long as the whole of the rest of the vertebral column put together? If one looks at detailed structure, the structure of the way in which the vertebrae join together is typically reptilian. It's not the way it occurs in birds. The pelvis is reptilian. The skull is particularly reptilian. Could I have the next slide, please? The skull is, if it were not connected, if it was not associated with that particular beast, would simply be taken to be a reptile. In fact, it now turns out that in this country there are some Archaeopteryx specimens or Archaeopteryx-like specimens, very similar to Archaeopteryx, but which do not have impressions of feathers around them. Those have, over long periods of time, been classified as reptiles. So we're dealing here with a form that if it were not for the feathers, we would call a reptile. But it has feathers. So you can't call it a typical bird because it's got a whole bunch of characteristics. Look at that skull. The middle one there is Archaeopteryx. The lower one is a typical bird skull. The one just above it is, again, a reptile, a thecodont reptile. It's not one of the reptiles, in fact, this is an oldish slide, it's not one of the reptiles that now we recognize is closer to Archaeopteryx than that particular one that is shown there. But the characteristics of the skull are almost entirely those of reptiles. There's just the slightest indication at the back of the skull of the beginning of the contracting of the occipital area, which is so characteristic of the birds. The brain is typically reptilian. Birds have very interesting brains. They have a highly specialized portion at the back, the cerebellum, at the back of the skull, which is particular at the back of the brain, which is particularly associated with coordination, the coordination of physical movement. And this is important for birds. Archaeopteryx didn't have it. So there are a whole lot of characteristics of this sort that are quite emphatically not bird characteristics, but it has feathers. So what it really is a reptile with feathers. And that is about as intermediate as you can get between reptiles and birds, even though these newer finds may in fact suggest, if when they're documented carefully, it is quite common in the first reportings of finds of this sort that the age is not accurate. And so we'll have to wait and see whether these new finds turn out, in fact, to be as old as they are said to be. But Archaeopteryx, nevertheless, demonstrates very nicely how a bird could be at least a reptile could be converted into a bird by having this thing which is really completely intermediate. It's simply well, it's playing with words, really, to say that that is a typical bird. It isn't a typical bird. It's very far from being a typical bird. Next slide, please. Oh, well, I won't bother with that now. There's just one other point that I would like to mention, and that is in connection with these transitional forms. You see, again, Dr. Gish takes the attitude that because evolution can't be true, there can't be these transitional forms. And he certainly has been able to find some quotations which suggest this. But for instance, it's quite hard to understand the one quotation that he gave from Gould, Stephen Jay Gould, who works right in the same building with Crompton, who did all the original work on the first Diarthrognathes that shows this beautiful transition from reptile through to mammal with a double hinged jaw and so on and so forth. Those specimens are there. They are not figments of the imagination. They are there. One can, I've looked at a large number of these personally. They show this transition. So would it not be more sensible, if one is really considering the evidence for evolution, not to look at the transitional forms we don't have, but to look at the ones we do have? To look at the reptiles. To look at the reptile transition, to look at the transition from amphibian to reptile, and a number of others that we have, where we've got detailed documentation of skeletal features at any rate. Mostly, of course, one doesn't have soft parts from the fossil record, and so one can say very little about those. Those are deductions from what we can learn about the fossil material. But we do have good, as Simpson points out, we do have good transitions. And so is it not reasonable to suppose that those that we don't have are not found simply because we haven't found the right deposits yet in which they occur? One must bear in mind that, as Simpson has very cogently argued, one does not find transitional forms in large populations. They are always small marginal populations. This is very easily understood and derivable from what we know about the genetics of populations, that there are marginal populations that do this. They're almost always, where major transitions are concerned, there are animals that are in very strange circumstances, and this is why their natural selection is so different that it produces quite different quite different adaptations. And in those circumstances, it doesn't help to go and look in the places where you find large populations, because those are not going to be the places where you will find that kind of transition. But you see, it's not a question of there aren't any, and so we're trying to cover the situation up by saying, well, they're going to be hard to find and so on and so forth. We do have transitions that are so extensive, as I say, that we simply have to adopt conventions as to how we classify these things, because there's no way in those intermediate transitional forms between, say, reptiles and mammals of pinning down exactly what they were, because they were a mixture of both of the major categories. And they, I submit, are sounder evidence of the possibility of these transitions, indeed the certainty of these transitions from this kind of evidence, rather than looking at the ones we haven't found. Thank you.
Dr. Gish with his first rebuttal of 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to go right back to this bird that Dr. Robinson was just dealing with. He insisted, and it shows the evidences of transitional form, shows evidence of evolution, would document the transition of a reptile to a bird. Now let me go to an expert in this area, Dr. W.E. Swinton, expert on birds, reptiles, the evolutionist, professor at the University of Toronto. In a book published in 1960, there was plenty of evidence available in Archaeopteryx at that time. He was familiar with the evidence. He wasn't ignorant of the evidence. In his chapter called The Origin of Birds, in Volume 1, Biology and Comparative Physiology of Birds, published in 1960, on page 1 of that Volume 1, Dr. Swinton makes the following statement in sentence 1. He says, quote, "The origin of birds is largely a matter of deduction. There is no fossil evidence of the stages through which the remarkable change from reptile to bird was achieved." End of quote. Listen, again, he says there is no fossil evidence of the stages through which the remarkable change from reptile to bird was achieved. There is no fossil evidence, is what he said. And I says you can infer, looking at Archaeopteryx and looking at reptiles and birds, that birds evolved from reptiles. You can infer that. But he says there's no fossil evidence for this transition. As a matter of fact, evolutionists claim that right now living birds have numerous reptilian characteristics. There's your proof of evolution. Just go out and look at a bird, and you can prove that he came from a reptile. Well, you can believe that if you want to. Now, let me refer you just reference to a paper published in Nature, October 28, 1976, volume 263, beginning on page 762, called Feathering and Flight, Evolution in Archaeopteryx. The author says we ought to look at Archaeopteryx from the viewpoint of an ornithologist, an expert on birds. Everybody's been looking at him from the viewpoint of a reptile. He says those feathers were delicate. And if he was running around on the ground and catching things with those feathers, as someone suggested, wasn't flying, they would be readily damaged. It'd be a tremendous disadvantage to this creature to have those feathers. Wasn't flying, as they say, and it would be a tremendous disadvantage to him as a non-flying creature, as a reptile, so to speak. And therefore, it doesn't seem a reasonable explanation. Again, I say that the evidence would indicate clearly that Archaeopteryx was a bird. He's found now with modern-type birds, undoubted modern-type birds. Hard to believe that he could have been the ancestor, that he could have been the ancestor of birds. Now that brings to mind a statement by Derek Ager, an evolutionist and a geologist, in his article, The Nature of the Fossil Record, published in the Proceedings of the Geological Association, Volume 87, 1976. Dr. Ager is an evolutionist. He sure doesn't like creationists using his literature, but nevertheless, he stated the facts, and I'd like to use them. He says, quote, "It must be significant that nearly all the evolutionary stories I learned as a student have now been debunked. Similarly, my own experience of more than 20 years looking for evolutionary lineages among the Mesozoic brachiopoda has proved them equally elusive, end of quote. Now, here's the point. Just as you have been exposed here tonight, Dr. Egger says, when I was in college, when I was a student, I was exposed to all these evolutionary stories, and practically every one of them has been debunked. Well, the present generation, you see, debunks the evolutionary stories of the previous generation while generating their own, which are eventually debunked by future generations. That has been the history of evolution. Some things that seem so reasonable, good evidence for evolution, which we could cite many, have now been admitted, never occurred in that order, could not have been used for, as evidence, should not have been used for evidence for evolution due to environmental influences and so forth and so on, were not valid evidences for evolution. Now, I also want to emphasize again that my motive here tonight in supporting creation is not the issue. You can be right for the wrong reason, or you can be wrong for the right reason. Did I use any religious literature of any kind tonight? Did I use the Bible? Did I use Genesis? I used solely scientific evidence, that's all. Doesn't make any difference what my motives are. You judge the scientific case that I have presented versus what evidence Dr. Robinson has presented for evolution, and judge on the basis of that, which seems to be the more reasonable case. Now, this matter of horses has been brought up by Dr. Robinson. Dr. Goldschmidt, in that same article that I quoted earlier, on the same page, said, that's on page 97, this article, American Scientist, volume 40, he says, moreover, within the slowly evolving series, like the famous horse series, the decisive steps are abrupt, without transitions. End of quote. The fact of the matter is we do have 3-toed horses and 1-toed horses in the fossil record. There are different kind of horses. I don't believe, and I don't know any creationists who do, that believe they all came from one created kind. They were separately created. We do not have the transitional points between these things that we would expect on the basis of evolution. As a matter of fact, in the John Day country of Oregon, the 3-toed horse is found with the 1-toed horse in the same formation. And Lecomte de Noy, an evolutionist, in his book Human Destiny, in 1947, and I guarantee there's been no change in this situation, if anything for the worse, on the horse evolution. He says in his book, Human Destiny, page 74, but each one, speaking of the horse, but each one of these intermediaries seem to have appeared suddenly, and it has not yet been possible, because of the lack of fossils, to reconstitute the passage between these intermediaries. Yet must have existed. The known forms remain separated like the piers of a ruined bridge. We know that the bridge has been built, but only vestiges of the stable props remain. The continuity we surmise may never be established by facts. End of quote. Yes, one may assume that this horse came from that horse, but again, that is an assumption and not documented by the evidence. Dr. Robinson has again referred to the reptile to mammal transition. Again, I think that some of the stories that Dr. Egger was referring to, or possibly or potentially will be. Now, the fact remains, ladies and gentlemen, that in all reptiles, living or fossil, they have a minimum of 4 bones in the lower jaw and 1 bone in the ear. And all mammals, living or fossil, have a single bone in the lower jaw, the dentary, and 3 bones in the ear. And there are no intermediates between. And furthermore, I would wish someone would explain how that reptile managed to hear while he was dragging the bones from the jaw up into the ear. I would like to find someone who could explain that step by step. And I repeat the statement of Dr. Gould. What good is a half a jaw, or a half a wing, or a half an ear? You couldn't hear, and I doubt if you could chew while this was going on. Now, about this resistance to antibiotics mentioned by Dr. Robinson, I believe he's a little bit behind the literature in that respect, because the latest literature, for example, I give you a reference in Science, volume 198, Sorry, I don't have the, somehow I don't have the year here. It's very recent, I think last year. Oh, here it is, October 1977, 14th of October 1977, Science, volume 198, page 198. We find the story of the plasmids. They have now discovered that the bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics, including streptomycin, which is mentioned by Dr. Robinson, that this resistance was not conferred by mutation, changing one gene slightly, a point mutation, anything like that. But the resistance to these antibiotics is conferred by a specific DNA molecule called a plasmid. And some bacteria are resistant to multiple antibiotics. Some resist to 6 antibiotics, and it's found that they have multiple plasmids, 6 separate DNA molecules, circular DNA molecules called plasmids, which can be transferred to other bacteria by conjugal union, by the actual union with other bacteria. They can be conveyed just like any other genetic characteristic. And this resistance to antibiotics then is not due to some mutation that occurs. You assault these bacteria with antibiotics and they mutate and develop resistance. That's not the case at all. As a matter of fact, a drug house had a bacterial culture that had frozen in 1946 before any of these bacteria had ever been exposed to antibiotics. Years later, they thawed out these bacteria, exposed them to the antibiotics, and found that they were resistant to the antibiotics because they had this resistant factor. We don't know why they possessed them, but they did. No example of a beneficial mutation arising in response to some environment, as suggested here. The industrial melanism has been cited. Sir Gavin de Beer, H.B.D. Kettlewell, and others who have studied this example of industrial melanism, the change of a predominantly light-colored variety of the peppered moth to a predominantly dark-colored variety of peppered moth, and the fact that earlier in 1850 the light-colored moth was very nicely camouflaged against the light-colored tree trunks. The variety, the melanic form, the dark variety of these peppered moths were very easily detectable. The birds naturally ate relatively larger numbers of them, and so they remained a small but stable proportion of the population. But with the Industrial Revolution, as the tree trunks got darker and darker and darker, pretty soon it was a dark-colored variety. It was difficult to see, and the light-colored variety was easy to see. So the birds began to eat more and more of the light-colored versus the dark-colored, and today 95% of these peppered moths are dark-colored. And H.B.D. Kettlewell and Sir Gavin de Beer is the most striking example of evolution ever seen by man. Well, in that case, then, man has never seen evolution, that's certain, because in 1850, these moths were peppered moths, Biston betularia, and in 1978 they all remain peppered moths, Biston betularia. They have not become mosquitoes or bumblebees or anything different. They haven't even become a different species of moth. And that is certainly no evidence for evolution. And I'm certainly not aware of these 3 to 5% of beneficial mutants mentioned by Dr. Robinson. I'd be very, very happy to have the documentation on that. I've been following this literature for many, many years. One time, Dobzhansky was challenged to name, of all the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of mutants of Drosophila that has been observed, some of the mutations results in blindness and sterility and stubby wings and no wings at all. A lot of bad things, a lot of bad flies. But as far as I know, we never produced a better fly by these mutations. When he was challenged to name examples, he could suggest at the very most 2 examples of these mutants which only had greater viability at higher temperatures, different temperatures that the normal does not exist, and could not under any conceivable circumstance be a benefit under natural, normal circumstances. And that is what evolution must do. Produce a beneficial change in a natural environment, not an unnatural environment created by man. Now, the Raphanobbrassica mentioned by Dr. Robinson also is absolutely no valid case at all. I have an article published by Dr. John N. Moore. He is a creationist, the only creationist I've referred to tonight and cited. in American Biology Teacher, January 1974, on page 49. And Dr. Moore reviews all the evidence related to Raphaenobrassica, and his conclusion reads as follows. Quote, clearly the broadly, uncritically popularized experiment of Karpachenko, and it's referring to this hybrid of the cabbage and so forth, and he said that the broadly, uncritically popularized experiment of Karpachenko of the so-called origin and establishment of a polyploid species has not been verified on reinvestigation in accordance with required rigorous application of precise scientific methodology. Meticulous scientists cannot accept at this point in time any cross of the Raphaenobrassica as a good example of a polyploid species, because full verification is far from complete. End of quote. As a matter of fact, the species could not exist in nature, would not have survived, much less fertile. It simply would have been rapidly eliminated. Now, this matter of homology, again, let me emphasize a very, very critically important evidence here. That you have the same structure in different animals or relatively similar. They are supposed to be homologous structures determined by a completely different gene. And even Dr. Robinson said, well, in the same species you have examples of this, where you have the same structure determined by completely different genes. I don't know the example. But how in the world would evolution do that? How can you explain such a thing? Evolution is due to the fact that genes change. That's how evolution occurs. That's what the theory is all about. Evolution occurs because genes evolve, genes change. And now we are told that the genes change, but the structure doesn't change. Now I can conceive of a supernatural God or a creator designing genes that will account for totally different structures. I can conceive of that, but not by any natural genetic process which is envisioned today as working for evolution. Could you ever suppose such a process could do that and produce the kind of changes that's supposed to have taken place in the genes without changing the structure? Can you imagine? Here are these complex of genes. I mean, there's a vast complex of genes that govern the eyes, tremendously complex genetic apparatus that determine the iris and the pupil and the rods and cones by the millions and the 10 million nerve cords from the brain to the eye. And of course the eyes mean nothing unless you have a brain to decode the message and convert it into an image. You have an incredibly complex genetic apparatus, and now evolutionists say that all these genes can evolve and just completely change, but the eye remains the same with no change at all. Absolutely, that goes against any mechanistic, naturalistic suggestion that I can imagine how evolution may have occurred. Now, thank you very much. I tell you one thing, and I'm not going to entertain remarks from the audience, by the way. It's entirely uncalled for. But I know genetics, ladies and gentlemen. You do too. Now I don't know who the gentleman was, but I wish somebody would go up to him and have him explain to you at the conclusion of this debate how genes can change completely, but the structure remains unchanged. Now, finally, it's all right. Sorry to get a little emotional. It's a very emotional subject, but we try to remain unemotional. But if it's your religion, that's all right. I would understand that. Now, I want to throw in this last paper. I don't know what thoughts Dr. Robinson might have on it. But Dr. Robinson and most evolutionists believe that man has evolved from some ape-like creature. Not all evolutionists, however, I find. Dr. Jeffrey Bourne, who is director of the Yerkes Regional Primate Research Center at Emory University. I looked Dr. Bourne, B-O-U-R-N-E, Dr. Jeffrey Bourne. I looked him up in the Who's Who in Science, and he has tremendous scientific qualifications. He's known in this field and that field and so forth and so on. Now he's supposed to be an expert in primatology, the study of primates. So he has impeccable qualifications as a scientist. He is an evolutionist. And he says, in view of the latest, oh, by the way, this article appeared in Modern People April 18, 1976, page 11. I wrote to I had my son write to Dr. Bourne. I didn't want to prejudice a reply. I had my son write to Dr. Bourne, send him the article, and ask Dr. Bourne, is this article correct? Did you really say this? I have his reply here with me. He says, yes, this article is correct. He really did say it. Now, what Dr. Bourne is saying is this, is that in the light of all the latest evidence that's been produced by Richard Leakey and others, and I won't go into detail at this time, except that Leakey believes he's produced something very, very man-like. He would say essentially man, or did at that time at least, it's much older than our so-called ape-like ancestors, at least as old, something like that. But Dr. Bourne says, in light of this evidence, it's now evident that we've been wrong all the time. He said, ever since Darwin, we've been teaching that man has evolved from some ape-like creature. But in light of this evidence, it is now plain that the apes and monkeys have evolved from man. That's what he says. That's what he says. The apes and monkeys have evolved from man, rather than man evolving from the apes. Well, a friend of mine told me when he heard that, he said, well, I'll be a monkey's uncle. And I guess we would be. But my whole point is this, ladies and gentlemen, how can it be that here are capable scientists, serious scientists, in one case saying the data indicates that the apes and monkeys have evolved from man, but the other evolutionists say no, man has evolved from the apes, or an ape-like creature. Now the theories are going like that. They're looking at the same data. Well, my conclusion is this, ladies and gentlemen, that the problem is not with the data. It's a basic set of preconceived ideas that man has when he studies origins. He is convinced, and Dr. Robinson is convinced, and the majority in the scientific establishment, there are many exceptions, there are literally thousands of scientists who are creationists, but the majority of the scientific establishment is convinced of the fact of evolution. That is dogma. You can challenge anything else. You can challenge a particular mechanism. You can challenge a particular phylogeny. But one thing you cannot do, you dare not do, is challenge the fact of evolution. You just do that in a scientific paper and try to get it published in Nature or Science or wherever. Even though your science is good, your conclusions seem to be logical. You won't get it published because the dogma of the establishment is evolution is a fact. I believe the evidence indicates clearly otherwise. Thank you very much.
Dr. Robinson for 5 minutes.
Well, I think the situation is fairly clear. There is, however, one point that I will not allow to pass, and that is the question of the reptile-mammal transition. Dr. Gish says that reptiles have 4 bones in the lower jaw and 1 kind of hinge, and mammals have 1 bone in the lower jaw and another kind of hinge, and there are no transitions. That is true of modern reptiles. But if you look at the fossil record, the transition is there with all the details, including a great deal of the detail of just how those 2 bones got into the middle ear along with the columella. I've seen the specimens. It doesn't help to say they aren't there. I think there is enough evidence now to indicate the point I made right at the beginning. There are 2 very different ways of looking at evidence here. And it's very difficult in circumstances like this to deal with a lot of the points that Dr. Gish deals with very quickly by some quotations from selected sources. Of course, there must be selected sources. Any quotations are from selected sources. But the point I'm trying to make is that there is a great deal of understanding about genetics that makes the kind of point that he made about how can it possibly be that you can get genes changing and yet what they producing not changing. It's perfectly clear to understand how this kind of thing happens. But in order to document that here, you can't do it by simply saying, oh, well, this happens and that happens. That's not the scientific way of doing it. But the understanding that we're gradually building up of genetics now makes one realize that our ideas about genetics, even a comparatively few years ago, were very crude and a great deal more sophistication. There's a lot more complication involved there than we had previously supposed. And this, after all, is a part of, at least this is an integral aspect of science. Dr. Gish, because of his particular orientation, throws these mistaken older interpretations or less effective older interpretations at scientists constantly. But this simply indicates a non-scientific way of looking at the situation. Because this is not the way one looks at science. Science is not a system that is threatened or reduced in stature by something being found wrong in its interpretations. By making mistakes and correcting them is the way science grows. Science does not start from a revelation which gives for all time what can be believed. It starts at the other end. It starts from nothing and tries to build up knowledge and increase the connections between different sorts of experimentation. You see, one sees this point of view coming through in a lot of what Dr. Gish says too. There's sort of implication that scientists were trying to bolster the idea of evolution. That's not the way it works at all, and that's not the way science works. That almost all of this evidence that is used by scientists as a basis for evolution has come in the course of doing other things. One's not setting out most of the time to prove an evolutionary point. And scientists are free to say whatever they want to, and almost any point of view that somebody expresses is challenged by somebody else. Again, this is the way science works. And suggesting that because one can show errors in science, this means that it's really got a weak point of view, is simply not looking at science the way the scientists who practice it look at it. Thank you very much.
Dr. Gish, your final 5-minute rebuttal.
Dr. Robinson has just been discussing how science operates, or how it's supposed to operate. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not the way scientists really operate. They don't approach problems with the absence of preconceived ideas or theories. As a matter of fact, this is a great point made by Stephen Jay Gould. He publishes a regular column in Natural History, a publication in the American Museum of Natural History, and he made the point that scientists don't operate that way. They don't go out and make observations and they construct a theory. They begin with a theory. They begin with a model. Really, facts are just dumb things until you attempt to interpret them. And before you interpret facts, you must decide, or you must at least decide on what sort of a model or basis you're going to interpret the facts. And the evolutionist begins with the assumption that the origin of the universe and living things have occurred through naturalistic, mechanistic processes. That's his beginning set of assumptions. And he believes sincerely that the evidence will fit. But that is his assumption. And of course, the evidence has to fit. can be made, must be made to fit. And all scientists operate alike. And evolution, again, I submit, is a dogma of the establishment today. There is no challenge permitted to the fact of evolution. Now, evolution is a random process. Now, I know that natural selection is not supposed to be a random process. But ultimately, the mutants, the varieties are produced by random processes. Now, if you shuffle the cards of a deck, those cards are randomly arranged. It doesn't make any difference. You've got 4 people sitting here waiting for the cards to be dealt, and they can either like it or they don't like it. Once they get the deal they want, maybe they can bid or do something like that. But they have to wait for that random process to produce what they need. So ultimately, evolution is a random process. Absolutely a random chance process. And it has been said by Loren Eiseley, for example, that man is a long series of DNA accidents. That's what we are. We're the product of millions and millions of mistakes, exactly what we are, acted upon by natural selection, of course, but we are the product of millions of mistakes. It's a random process. Absolutely could not produce what is supposed to have been produced in 5 billion years or what. Now, in that respect, this Norman Macbeth, who is an evolutionist, he's certainly not a creationist. Now, he's a lawyer, not a biologist, but he's a highly intelligent person with a logical mind. He is trained to examine the evidence, and he has devoted tremendous study to the modern theory of evolution. He's published the results in the Journal of Systematic Zoology, in the American Biology Teacher. He is getting a hearing. And he says in this article published in November 1976 in American Biology Teacher, Darwinism is not science. It is untestable. It is non-falsifiable. Therefore, it is not a scientific theory. He says Darwinism has failed in practice. The whole aim and purpose of Darwinism is to show how modern forms descended from ancient forms. That is to construct reliable phylogenies, or genealogies, or family trees. In this, it has utterly failed. And he cites some of the same literature that I use in that respect. He says natural selection is a tautology, a circular reasoning. You ask what survived, and they say, what's the fittest survive? And you say, what's the fittest? They say, those that survive. And it collapses into a tautology. This is another criticism of modern evolutionary theory. And we could go on and on and on, ladies and gentlemen. And how much time do I have in my? About 1.5 minutes. Now, Stephen Jay Gould, again, in Natural History, June of 1976. Now, he says, now I don't want to represent Dr. Gould. I don't want anybody to go out here and say I quoted him out of context. He does believe in evolution. He does believe in the geological column and differences in the geological column. He believes that. But listen to what he says. Quote, the 3-leveled 5-kingdom system may appear at first glance to record an inevitable progress in the history of life that I have often opposed in these columns. Increasing diversity and multiple transitions seem to reflect a determined and inexorable progression towards higher things. But the paleontological record supports no such interpretation. There has been no steady progress in the higher development of organic design. We have had instead vast stretches of little or no change and one evolutionary burst that created the entire system. For the first 2/3 to 5/6 of life history, monarans alone, that's the single-cell organism with no true nucleus, bacteria, blue-green algae. He says, for the first 2/3 to 5/6 of life history, monarans alone inhabited the earth, and we detect no steady progress from lower to higher prokaryotes. Likewise, there has been no addition of basic design since the Cambrian explosion. So the conclusion of the scientists in this field, there has been no steady progression of simple to complex as we would expect on the basis of evolution theory, at least that's commonly accepted. Well, I think I'll close there. I have some other remarks I could make. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Let me just once again urge you to do this. If you can, look at the evidence in an objective fashion. Now, maybe you're not biased, maybe you're not prejudiced one way or the other. Look at the evidence. All the evidence is available. The evidence from the fossil record we presented here tonight, the evidence from genetics and biology, and all the areas of science. Just compare that evidence to the predictions or the descriptions that you'd expect on one hand on the basis of creation, on the other hand the basis of evolution. Compare the data to the predictions and then decide for yourself which model does the data fit best. I am convinced undoubtedly the data fits the creation model in a far superior manner. Thank you very much.